welcome everybody to the 4th annual Human Rights and History Lecture sponsored by Towson University's Department of History and the Human Rights and History minor. My name is Professor Kimberly Katz. I'm the coordinator for the Human Rights and History minor. Tonight, we've invited Professor Ken McLean, professor in the Department of International Development, Community and Environment, and the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University as our featured speaker for the 4th annual Human Rights and History Lecture. This is an important event each year for minors in the Human Rights and History program and members of the Towson community studying and researching in a broad array of human rights issues. We're live on Zoom tonight too, so everybody on Zoom, please know that we're recording this, and for those of you who ask questions later, that will become part of the recorded conversation. I'll probably repeat them for the benefit of our people attending via Zoom. Just for a little background, for those of you who might not know, the History Department launched the minor in fall 2019, and by the end of that academic year, we had 9 enrolled minors. Now in the middle of its 4th year, nearly in the middle of its 4th year, the Human Rights and History minor boasts close to 25 enrolled minors. 7 students have graduated with a minor in Human Rights and History since spring 2020. And students find that the minor meets their desire to blend their academic interest in human rights with the practical experience that they gain during their culminating human rights internship experience. 4 students are currently doing their internships, at least one of them's here and maybe others on the Zoom call. And those students will be graduating in May, bringing the total of students who will have graduated with a minor in human rights and history to 11 students. I think we're very proud of that. And it'll be exciting to follow their paths once they leave Towson University. With academic training in anthropology and history, Professor McLean draws on his experiences working for human rights organizations in Southeast Asia in the book he'll speak about tonight, which will be, you can see it here on the screen, which will be of particular interest to historians who are always keen to learn more about archives. Tonight's lecture will complicate our understanding of archives, a topic that has been getting a lot of academic scholarly attention in the past several years, a lot of new books published in my field on Saudi Arabia, Iraq, medieval Cairo, and other places. And so I think students will find the questions raised in Professor McLean's work about how archives developed, what we learned from them, and what's missing in them particularly stimulating as they grapple with archival material in their research papers and at their internship sites. Professor McLean's talk focuses on Myanmar, a Southeast Asian country with a deep history of gross human rights violations. Myanmar is not alone in this regard, we should note. So in his talk, we'll learn about the fact-finding practices of different organizations, whether human rights, legal, or humanitarian. At least after reading some of his book over the past week, this is what I think he's going to be talking about. Professor McLean's first book, The Government of Mistrust, Illegibility, and Bureaucratic Power in Socialist Vietnam, was published in 2013 by the University of Wisconsin Press. His new book, Crimes in Archival Form, Human Rights, Fact Production, and Myanmar, is just published this year by the University of California Press. Sorry, my iPad jumped. And he'll share some comments on that topic. On a related note, I want to mention that the History Department added a second lecture series to its Human Rights and History programming last year. The new lecture series is titled Human Rights in the Field and reflects the importance of the experiential component of our minor, as all student minors are required to complete an internship. So the second annual Human Rights in the Field lecture will be delivered on February 16th at 5 p.m. in 4310, the other end of the hall, if you want to mark your calendar. It'll be delivered by Krish Omara Vignaraja, who's the president and CEO of the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service here in Baltimore. She has a fascinating background, went to high school in Baltimore County, college and law school at Yale University, and served as policy director for First Lady Michelle Obama and senior advisor in the Department of State under both President Obama's Secretaries of State, Hillary Clinton and John Kerry. Ooh, what a... Omara Vignaraja will talk in February on global migration and U.S. immigration, so keep your eyes out for the electronic flyers. I want to thank my colleagues both in history and in collaborating departments, as well as History Department Chair Christian Coate, who is at a conference and unfortunately couldn't be here and sends his regrets, along with Dean Chris Chulos, who also had another event scheduled before I sent him an invitation. He sent his regrets, but I do want to recognize their support and all of the colleagues who help in making this program attractive to students. Several former human rights and history students now graduated, I think are on the Zoom call, so a shout out to them. Welcome to everybody. And I just want to add a couple of notes. For those on the Zoom call, please submit your questions after Professor McLean's talk, and I'll read them out for him in the Q&A. And reminder, join us for the food so that we don't have to take bags of food home. Welcome, Professor McLean.
All right. Good evening, everyone. It is a delight to see so many faces without masks. Long may that be the case. And for those of you wearing masks, thank you for coming as well. I'll just imagine what your faces look like. I wanted to begin, in addition to that, thanking Professor Katz for the invitation on behalf of the History Department and the Human Rights minor. I'm delighted to be here and to share some of my work with you tonight. It's been wonderful so far, and hopefully I won't disappoint. All right. Now, the first part of my presentation will draw upon my recent book. It's not going to be a book talk per se, but I am going to talk about some aspects of it to give you a sense of what I'm trying to do in the book. And the second part of my presentation will be looking at some of the lessons learned that I will speak about, obviously, and say how might they inform, or what kinds of questions might they raise for current justice and accountability efforts that are underway against the military regime today. So it's looking at archives in the history, looking backwards, and in light of that, what might we think about in terms of lessons learned in terms of how we move forward. Right? There we go. All right. Now, at its core, my book has three overarching questions. First, why are many, if not most, human rights facts fashioned rather than found? Second, what are the implications of this claim, theoretically, methodologically, ethically, and legally? And third, how can we productively move the human rights movement forward towards greater disclosure and greater transparency, given that fact production is an inescapable part of the process? That is, if we are unaware how human rights organizations reach the conclusions they do, the methods by which they get them, the assumptions upon which they operate, the methodological choices, and so on, how do we evaluate the truth claims of people whose business it is to make truth claims about human rights violations? And this becomes particularly challenging in the current environment, as you well know, an environment characterized by disinformation, misinformation, and the outright denial of what is demonstrably true. Now, since 1990, I have coordinated fact-finding teams, served as an outside consultant to them, led human rights organizations, and carried out scholarly research in a number of settings: Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Tibet, and most enduringly in Myanmar. Consequently, I've been intimately familiar and involved with human rights fact production for longer than most of you have been alive. It's kind of terrifying when you think about that. Now, this involvement includes being complicit in many of the practices I describe in the book, and some I'll touch upon today. But it was not until 2007 that I began to seriously reflect on this issue. So I'll begin with an incident that prompted me to do so. Here are just two quick maps of Myanmar with best guess portrayals or depictions of an oil and gas pipeline from the offshore up into China. And these tiles represent where there was satellite imagery in existence of these areas. And these are blank spots where none was taken. And I'll explain the significance of that. Now, in 2007, I was working for Earth Rights International, an NGO that documents the relationship between human rights violations and environmental crimes. We were concerned about an agreement involving the military regime in Myanmar and the South Korean company Daewoo that planned to construct an oil and gas pipeline from the Martaban Gulf to Yunnan province in China. Prior infrastructure projects, most notably the Yadana and Yetagun pipelines, which now supplies Thailand with much of its electrical power, resulted in widespread and systematic human rights abuses. Chief among them, forced relocations and the massive use of forced labor. The Doe v. Unocal lawsuit, which Earth Rights International was party to, concluded in a precedent-setting victory on the basis of the legal principle of universal jurisdiction. As a result, Unocal was found guilty of aiding and abetting these abuses by employing the military to provide security on the project. The energy company paid an undisclosed amount of money, it was really about $5 million, to the victims and created a community fund in response. And the French energy company Total, in a separate suit, was also found guilty and made a settlement. So with those past events in mind, we discussed how a monitoring mechanism could possibly prevent similar abuses from occurring in the connection with the construction of this one. Satellite monitoring, ideally to be paid for by the principals, would provide the key means, we argued, to achieve this end. And as part of the information gathering process, I interviewed a satellite imagery expert, the Natural Resources Defense Council, to learn how we could best integrate satellite imagery into such a monitoring mechanism, looking at before and after images to identify whether forced relocations and other things were taking place. Now, the monitoring project did not happen for a variety of reasons, but the backstory about the efforts of the Hidden Gulag Report, their efforts to identify forced labor camps in North Korea using such imagery was eye-opening. Summarized here, the processes involved a series of unexpected translations. And the US Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, which authored the report, sought to identify the geographic location of an estimated 7 political penal labor camps. These camps physically resembled those camps of incarcerated prisoners, criminals as opposed to political prisoners. So it was really important to try and distinguish the criminal ones from the political ones. Now, the defectors, former guards, found it difficult to do this, to identify on the imagery where these camps were located, because they were first and foremost unfamiliar with the imagery. So although the images contained an impressive amount of visual detail, which you can see on this one, roads, railways, fields, etc., the defectors remained unsure as to what they were looking at in most instances, because they themselves were not told which camps they were serving in. They were simply dropped off, did their duties as guards, and brought back. They had no idea where in North Korea they themselves actually were. So the ad hoc solution was to print and then enlarge sections of imagery to create a meta image large enough for the defectors to actually walk around in. So they would take large pictures, and they would be 5 by 10 feet, and piece them together on the floor, and they'd take off their shoes, and then they would walk around the camps. And in doing so, these defectors were able to translate the visual perspective, the vertical perspective, into a horizontal one that actively activated embodied memories of place. That is, by walking this way and remembering to turn left at this point and turning right at this point, they could identify this was in fact a camp they had worked in as opposed to one they had not. And after doing so, the former guards could more easily confirm the location of the camps, the purposes they served, and their spatio-functional organization. The outcome was a report that had a critical impact on US government policy vis-a-vis North Korea as a consequence of its human rights abuses. Now, this case, at least in my mind, provides a clear and concise example of the overarching goal of the book, which is to complexify human rights fact-finding. Fact-finding, as it is conventionally understood, entails the determination of what transpired, who bears responsibility, and what kinds of action are recommended in response. The who, what, where, why, and when, if you will. Yet the means by which answers to these questions are reached rarely receives critical reflection beyond informal conversations amongst practitioners. My book, I hope, adds to these efforts with one simple question: how do fact finders know what they claim to know? Fact finding, in other words, is a process, as represented here on this slide. To put it more precisely, facts don't exist out there, as the opening quotes I showed a few minutes ago indicate. Facts are argumentative practices, if nothing else. And as a consequence, they are fashioned at different moments in this process and in different ways within each moment of this process. Methodological choices, analytical decisions, and the public presentation of findings are just some of the many steps involved in the fact production process. But these steps are black boxed. In other words, they are hidden from audiences that consume the findings, making it difficult to scrutinize the validity of the reports produced. So with that in mind, I faced a central representational challenge to show why these black boxes exist, what happens inside them, and their consequences for better and for worse. Now, Jacques Derrida wrote a very significant book in the 1990s known as Archive Fever. He was far from the first person to analyze archives as a concept. And in his work, accelerated an already ongoing need or trend to make the archive the central subject of analysis. That is to foreground the archive in quotation marks, rather than treating it simply as a repository, a material repository for records, or a digital one, increasingly these days. Now, many scholars across many disciplines took up this challenge, which requires, I think, a serious effort to write both with and against the grain, to borrow a phrase from anthropology/historian Ann Stoler. Now, in the context of this book, writing with and against the grain requires a double movement. First, I had to tell a story about how particular facts were produced. How many murders were committed, what kinds of forced labor happened here, how many people were displaced, and so on, and how these facts were produced and not simply found by enumerating. Second, I also had to unwrite this same story to illustrate the epistemological, methodological, ethical, and legal issues in play. In other words, I needed to maintain a delicate balance between constructing an intelligible narrative while also deconstructing that same narrative to show how the story was made. Whether or not I succeeded, I leave to you once you finish the book. So those are some introductory framing concepts. What I want to do is give you some visuals now of the area in which I worked. And then I'm going to move in on a section about forced labor and the practice of verbatim, a direct quotation, and verbatim once removed, which is a quote of a quote, and ad nauseum. And then I'm going to shift gears and talk about how some of what I've discussed is relevant to the contemporary situation, because people are often curious to know what is happening and why it matters. All right. So for those of you not familiar with Southeast Asia, you can look over here at this inset map. You can see Myanmar is bordered by Bangladesh on the west, Thailand to the east, and China to the north. This is a administrative map. And my work was concentrated in Karen State, renamed Cayenne State, with a particular focus on this northern section, which is in a line that was ground zero for a 3-year military offensive involving over 50 battalions of military regime's army. Here's a quick shot of the terrain heading east out of the plains into the mountains of Karen State, heading towards the Thai border. And as you can see, it's steep terrain, small valleys punctuated with rivers running through them. And this, you get people farming in some of the lowland areas. And when military operations occur, they're displaced. And here is a picture of a forced relocation in progress when troops set fire to a village. Here is the remnants of a house in that same village. Here's a woman looking through the ashes to see if she can recover anything of value or use. Here are some internally displaced persons or IDPs with their young children living in temporary shelters in the jungle. Here is a village evacuating the region because military patrol is coming into it. And here is a little IDP hiding site made of natural materials. Here's a tube of bamboo, the loop over the arm, and they would walk down into the valleys to get water and hike it back up. People would be in these shelters days or weeks, although in some cases, so-called black zones, which were free fire zones, people might live in them for several years. And I apologize for the blurry resolution. I couldn't find a better one, but as you can see by the intensity of the dots up there in the northern part of Granite State, where I worked, it had historically been an epicenter of so-called counterinsurgency operations. At this point, according to our best guess, based on field research, over 3,600 villages have either been destroyed, relocated, or abandoned because of military activity. Right. So before turning to the specific violations and forced labor in particular, which the International Criminal Court meets the criteria for crimes against humanity, I do provide an ethnographic history of counterinsurgency to help situate the reader for a non-country specialist. And I ask what these armed conflicts, this is only being one. As you can see from the slide, all these different blotches are different territories controlled by different armed groups, many of them ethnically organized, but not entirely. So as you can see, until comparatively recently, the state controlled a little bit more than half of its own territory. So there are many, many conflicts driven by many, many causes. But I mentioned the ethnographic history because I try to flip the dominant narrative on its head and ask, what happens if we think about the state as the insurgent? And that the actions by these different non-state armed groups are actually countering state violence rather than a state-centric narrative that often dominates the literature on Myanmar. But this chapter is important in another way, more broadly, I think. And that is the violent strategies and tactics used and their change over time, or their lack of change over time in some cases, provides important details about the context in which fact finders work. They do not work in vacuums. That the dynamics of the conflict create certain possibilities and impose certain kinds of limits on what kind of documentation work human rights defenders can do. And so not all places are created equal, and they change over time. And I'm happy to expand on this in the Q&A when I can talk about why some areas are so much better documented than other ones. As for the book itself, just to give you the overview, I mentioned the chapter on insurgency and counterinsurgency. I then have 1, 2, 3, 4 major case studies, each of which features a different fact-finding group. One is a law clinic, another one consists of 2 humanitarian organizations, another one is a local human rights group, and then an international consortium or collaboration that worked in a loose movement. And in each chapter, and I'm not going to go into detail now, but I focused on a particular element of the fact-finding strategies used and the issues they raise. And to just give you a taste of that, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about verbatim. Now, the chapter on forced labor, which is considered a contemporary form of slavery by the International Labor Organization, and in fact, by international law, it was organized around a story of the Karen Human Rights Group, the KHRG. And the central point I want to make here in this context is the KHRG did not set out to make an archive on forced labor. Rather, it began producing situation reports that it fed to the International Labor Organization for the advocacy purposes, with the ILO pressuring the government to try and eradicate forced labor in all its forms. And here's just a picture of civilians who've been forced at gunpoint to carry military supplies into frontline areas, which is a war crime. So what I want to say is these individual reports gradually, and I trace how it became standardized in terms of form and content over time. And this evolution matters not just because of the case I'm looking at. It points to something that is often overlooked when you look at human rights documentation if you do not take a historical perspective. And that is, archives have biographies. They have life histories. And that matters in terms of collection protocols, information management, access provisions, and so on. It's not just what's in the archive and what's left out of it, but how it's organized and made available or not for people to look at its contents. And so these elements shape not only what an archive contains, as I just mentioned, but what kinds of questions can be asked about the records in them. What kinds of stories can be told about them, and what the answers mean for the writing of history or the writing of history of these conflicts more generally. Now, the archive that emerged, the sort of organic, accidental archive that emerged, organized forced labor orders, written documents by military given to headmen of villages telling them what they had to do and what they had to give under penalty of fines or violence or arson, forced relocation. And they were generally organized into these 5 main categories, and each of the reports, which contain hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of verbatim reproductions of these forced labor orders, was organized in this way. And that organization, I'll explain in a few minutes, is significant in terms of how we can understand the phenomena of forced labor. Right? So one of the techniques of fact production I discuss in the book and in this chapter in particular is called verbatim, which is in everyday terms, a quotation, a reproduction that allows you to say A and A1 are the same, if not in form, but in content. And this kind of reproduction of quotes and quotes of quotes is omnipresent in human rights reporting. And what I try to do in this chapter is reverse engineer the practice of verbatim to pose a question. What are the historical, technological, and socio-political conditions that make verbatim possible, that make us believe what is quoted is an accurate representation of what is being quoted? And these questions are at the center, as I've suggested, of human rights truth claims, which rest upon a degree of epistemological stability. That is, facts need to remain stable facts, otherwise they cease to be facts, right? You need to believe in their fixedness, that they're stable. And I try to show the ways in which that appearance and sometimes illusion are created. So what was I working with? Looking at these reports that formed a collection that I then argue formed a kind of archive, I looked at 2,000 plus forced labor orders, and I have a picture in a moment of what they look like. And these are verbatim statements in form and content of military officials giving orders to villages, as I mentioned. I also worked with 142 testimonies of criminals who were forced to order military supplies under threats of violence. And so we're looking at reports of verbatim speech. And just to briefly touch on these, I looked at them from a variety of perspectives, and here are, I believe, 6 of them. And one of the key things I want to focus on now is typicality versus extremes. One of the things you find in human rights research is a tendency to identify and put forward the most extreme cases. And that has value. There's a point in doing so. But it also risks masking or erasing the kinds of violations people endure on a day in and day out basis that are simply not spectacular. They don't make the news because they're not visually engaging or captivating, if I can even use that word. And that is why KHRG organized the reports in the manner I indicated a few slides ago. But that is a problem. Why is it a problem? Because it doesn't show how these practices, these various practices here intersect, and how some forms of forced labor beget new forms of forced labor. As the seasons change, or you rebuild a bridge, and then you have to build sentry stations that you then have to man and feed and pay for yourself. And then you have to clear the brush to prevent ambushes and so on. So this stuff is not separating it by category as it's presented in their archive is problematic because it erases the system and how it functions and the long-term effects it has on people's lives. So in sum here, verbatim is never truly verbatim. That is, something is always added or taken away because verbatim is a form of translation. Human rights reports hide this process as part of their effort to perform methodological rigor, analytical objectivity, and evidence-driven recommendations. So I jump back. Here's an image of the slide with the redaction on it to hide the name. And here are prison porters being carried ammunition to the front. So these points are a useful reminder that human rights data do not speak for itself is the central point, both in this chapter and in the book itself. It must always be represented and then spoken for by somebody, often diverse ways that hide the conditions of its portrayal. The question then is, how does this occur and what are the consequences in terms of the way we represent the suffering and pain of others to different audiences? And that is a thought I want to carry forward with this famous dancing woman. If you've ever been to Asia, you'll know it's quite common for most often, but not always, women to record dance exercise routines that they then play in front of crowds of sometimes thousands. This woman was in the military capital in Naypyidaw, recording her workout. And as you can see in the background, as she was starting her workout, you see the beginning of the coup. These are the military vehicles rolling out to seize control of Congress and basically arrest the entire country's government. So thinking of these abuses, forced labor, torture, disappearance, sexual violence, including using rape as a weapon of war, destruction of food, on and on, has worsened in many respects since the coup in 2021. So in a year and a half, to our best guess, this is the cost of this in terms of human lives. It does not include the number of government and army personnel that have been killed in the fighting. It's hard to get those figures for understandable reasons. But you can also see the spread from where the initial violence was located to where it is now. So currently, about half of the country is racked with violence, primarily the army killing civilians and self-formed militias trying to kill army back. It's an asymmetrical war. All right. Now, the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, which is a UN body, have both adopted legal approaches to achieve accountability. The ICC has charged high-ranking government and military officials with crimes against humanity for the forced deportation of nearly 700,000 Rohingya to Bangladesh. And here's one of the iconic images of that. Myanmar is not party to the Rome Statute, however, but Bangladesh is, which gives the ICC standing to hear the case. While the regime has not permitted ICC investigators to carry out fact-finding missions to Myanmar, the sheer prima facie evidence that the crimes occurred in 2017 and 2018 is convincing, and a prosecution victory is highly likely. And these red dots are all villages that were burnt to the ground by the military and were verified using satellite imagery doing before and after mapping. The ICJ case is more complicated, however, because it involves the charge of genocide, which has a very high evidentiary bar with the need to demonstrate mens rea, or intent, to destroy a group either in whole or in part. Efforts by the regime to have the ICJ case dismissed failed in August of this year, and the legal proceedings will continue to move forward. But as was the case with the ICC, it will likely be years before we have a judgment. The UN's independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar, more easily known as the IIMM, which began its work in September of 2018, informs both the ICC and the ICJ efforts. Given the lack of access to the country, the IIM's efforts are now geared towards collecting resources in order to analyze what I've called human rights facts. As of August, they claim to have collected more than 3 million what they call information items. And here is a list of the main ones by category. Now, the IMM is not the first to adopt this strategy. And we can talk in Q&A what are the sort of challenges of working with this information. The Syria Archive perhaps represents the leading example of such a documentation effort with international criminal accountability proceedings in mind. The recently published Berkeley Protocols also set out to define current views on what best practices are in this area. And here's just an interesting image. Again, I'm happy to talk about the Syria Archive, although some people may not know more than that than me in here. They're using artificial intelligence to scan images and identify, in this case, tear gas canisters. They're tear gas. Yes. And use that to calculate to document different human rights issues, because using tear gas against civilians is a crime against humanity as well. So I don't think anyone has really attempted what the IIMM, the UN effort, has done, at least to this scale, with Syria Archive perhaps being the exception. But without further details, the IIMM understandably did not disclose its methodologies in its recent annual report. So it is impossible for me to say anything meaningful about the pros and cons of the approach that's currently in use. We'll have to wait and see. But given these high-profile efforts and other like them, some scholars like Karen Engel have criticized NGOs for what they label the prosecutorial turn in human rights advocacy and action more internationally. As a result of this, human rights fact production is increasingly geared towards the standards of proof that lawyers insist upon. My position: I fully support efforts to hold perpetrators legally accountable for their crimes when proven. For this reason, I think it is important for human rights NGOs to understand what qualifies as evidence in a legal context, because most human rights reports don't do that, and what kinds of documentation are needed for it to be admitted as probative evidence: timestamps, proof of authenticity, chain of custody, and so forth. But at the same time, the prosecutorial turn has further narrowed what types of abuses get focused on. The violation of civil and political liberties being the most common one. Consequently, the forms of structural violence that affect the economic, social, and cultural rights of people, arguably many more people, go unprosecuted. We simply don't have the mechanisms for pursuing the violations of these rights in terms of criminal law, much less meaningfully take into account other kinds of non-legal efforts to achieve justice outside the courtroom. So as to the ongoing violence in Myanmar today, and I'm almost done, the struggle to resist resurgent military rule has, unsurprisingly, resulted in more widespread and systematic military atrocities. The situation is both fluid and at the same time a stalemate, with neither side able to defeat the other. The chaos has made it quite difficult to document what is happening, even as there has been an ongoing tidal wave of reports, first-person accounts, social media posts, film clips, and so on. The volume and speed of these official and unofficial forms of fact-finding far exceeds our ability to gather, verify, much less analyze the material in a methodologically coherent and sound way, though, as I mentioned, there are efforts to do so. So to close, what does human rights fact production mean to me, or why does it matter? The book was cathartic in many ways, although I did not write it for this reason. I have long felt uncomfortable and sometimes complicit in the very practices I critique in the book. But at the same time, my goal was not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, as it were. I think so much more can be done to improve how we do our work, which in my perspective must include much greater transparency and disclosure about how we actually do it. So while the book is focused on Myanmar, the forms of fact production described in it are not unique to it in any way. Human rights NGOs everywhere use these and other strategies not discussed, and they deserve introspection and constructive debate, not just with practitioners, not just with academics, but also with policymakers and interested parties. So I'll stop there and take questions. Thank you. I'll share.
Is it okay if I turn off?
Okay, so I just look for raised hands. Are you using the Zoom first?
Let's see if I can get to the Zoom. Oh, let's stop sharing. Okay, so the floor is open. I'll even turn on the lights, so everybody, kind of. I would like to do that when it's been dark in the classroom to make sure everybody kind of feels like.
Wakes back up. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So the floor is open. If anybody, and please in the Zoom room, feel free. I did prepare a question in advance in case anybody. Professor Donovan.
So I found your presentation really very interesting. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on the balance of what would I say, importance, right, of the different categories of facts that are gathered, right? And particularly, I wonder how testimonies from displaced, internally displaced people, testimonies from perhaps police officers on the other side, forced laborers, how those testimonies measure up against other forms of investigative facts, so to speak. So photographic evidence, satellite imagery, documents, right, that the regime might or might not make accessible or that you might capture. And within that concept, especially when you're working in some of these societies where I think gender relations are probably uneven, is there a way in which women and children's testimony is this is a supposition, right? So for you to comment on, has a different value than, let's say, male victims, testimony.
So, great series of questions.
Sorry.
I did the same thing. So if I miss anything,
Yeah.
please
Whatever you
bring me
want.
back. One of the things that intrigued and I might say actually troubled me a little bit when I was looking back is, on one hand, there is, just as there was an archival turn in many of the non-historical disciplines, there was a cultural turn in history. Moment. There is a fact-finding turn in the human rights world, as it were. And so even as there are growing calls for greater standardization, because there is no agreement on what best practices are, there is at the same time a proliferation of more handbooks and guidebooks and training manuals and so on. So we're in this flowering, if you will, of non-agreement. Similarly, different organizations to official fact-finding missions by UN bodies and other things have different thresholds by which they make determinations of seriousness of a crime, like the preponderance of evidence or sufficient evidence, and they're all defined in different ways. So the point I'm making here is the metrics by which different groups assign different kinds of evidentiary weight to testimonies or photos or satellite images is not consistent. And there's no agreement. And you see that from the local level through, certainly through all the criminal courts at different scales. One of the big problems is that with the rise of digital evidence, which has been accelerating and the places like the International Criminal Court are struggling to keep up. It was not until 2014, if I remember correctly, that they actually put money in the budget to have analysts work with this material. And the media revolution began a good way before that, and they don't have a resource to stay on top of it. But one of the big problems is many of the judges, to give one example, are older. They're at the end of their careers. They're very senior. They're in their 60s and 70s after a long distinguished career being judges somewhere else, and then they serve at the ICC level. And so they were not digital natives, you say. So they don't often know how to read the digital material. In a way, they look at a map and see a map, which is the result of many kinds of decisions and technical manipulation by producers. So they've begun doing a lot of training work with lawyers and with judges so that they can have a more informed what it is they're looking at. So that's one thing. The gender issue is a really interesting one. It both matters and doesn't matter, which you might expect. So in the case of the Rohingya, where mass rape as a weapon of terror, it wasn't war, they were attacking defenseless civilians. It was really widespread, and it was very challenging at first because it's a very patriarchal Muslim community where the head of the household, which is in almost all cases, speaks on behalf of everyone else in the household. So finding ways to get female researchers able to speak with women and girls about a very traumatic experience was very challenging. In the course of doing so, the Rohingya are in many respects perhaps the best documented refugees in the world right now, because so much effort has been put into interviewing people about every aspect. And there's interview fatigue where people are tired. But the issue you raised before that's really interesting. That's the question of narrativity. How do people shape and tell stories about traumatic experiences? And I hope you've never had one, but if you have, you know that it's very hard to tell a story that begins with A and ends with Z in a nice, clear, linear way. It's fragmentary, gaps, jump back, you have digressions, all kinds of things. And that kind of narrative, when reproduced in verbatim form, doesn't carry a lot of weight in legal systems because it actually undermines your credibility. It makes it sound like you don't know what you're saying or what you experienced, when that is, in fact, the result of the trauma you experienced. So what you often have in human rights reports, what's called in transcription studies, Englishing, where they edit, sometimes lightly, sometimes less lightly, those fragmentary narratives into a coherent story. And it's done often with the best of intentions. But what you're reading about is not what was said. And then you've got the translation of idiomatic speech, the legal speech for those communities to accept it. So in short, there are many, many kinds of, lots of editing going on, lots of translating going on, which things are being, in which they're lost. That if you don't understand the process and simply read the report, it is a photograph of a film. It's a still film. And I'm not saying that's inherently bad, but if you want to maintain credibility in an era when there's deep fakes and misinformation and so on, I think organizations must be a lot more transparent about how they do their work for better enforcement. I'll give you one more example and then I'll be quiet. Okay.
Zoom there.
Okay, sorry. I think all of you have one point, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, NGO human rights group. They spent around $70 million last year on fact finding. I'm not counting staff costs and everything else. They don't have the training manual. They do not have systematic, centralized. If you get hired to be a human rights documentation expert, you go through this mandatory month-long boot camp, and here are standards, here's how you do it, here's how you do X, Y, and Z. They don't. They often hire journalists who have deep in-country knowledge, but may not have been trained as human rights researchers. So for me, that is kind of eye-opening. You have Human Rights Watch claiming to be a paragon of research, and I'm not saying they don't do excellent work, they often do, but they're not exactly being transparent about how they work private, and that opens them up to all kinds of criticism potentially if you know this. So I don't know if I got everything.
I think I think it's particularly important what you said about male heads of households having to be the intermediary between a investigator and the family, when there's all sorts of issues of honor in respect to the family.
Yeah.
So thank you.
So I'm gonna go to a question on Zoom first, and then as you're generating your thoughts there. One of the students asks, says the UN has spoken up against the coup, I assume the 2021 coup. Have any world superpowers taken action?
Great question. Yes, the usual suspects have criticized it. So many of the EU countries, the United States, Canada, Australia, many authoritarian regimes like Russia, which is becoming Burma's biggest military partner at the moment, and China say it's an internal affair and do that. And then you've got the bulk of the other countries just sitting quietly on the sideline because they don't want to get in the middle of this. But there's some other complicating factors if you remember one of the closing slides. The military regime is heavily dependent on Chinese aid, investment and aid function. The Chinese play both sides by also supporting many of the armed groups. So it's hedging its bets. The biggest thing that can happen now is for the so-called international community to support the government in exile, the national immunity government, by actually recognizing it officially as the legal representative of the country. It consists of all those elected officials who were forced out and went into exile for their own lives, and finding ways to support them. They are not, however, going to receive the kind of military aid that Ukraine gets because of global or geopolitics. So they get some assistance, but not nearly enough, which is why things are at sort of a standstill in some ways.
So I was thinking about your book a little bit as I was reading some news in the Israeli newspapers. And I was thinking about this issue you raised in your introduction, and you mentioned it tonight, this tension between trust and betrayal, honoring personal promises, things you didn't want to disclose for various reasons, for the safety of others, things that you chose not to know. I thought that was a really interesting kind of phrase about cross-border human rights documentation, such as details regarding weapons procurement, the redistribution of human aid, fee structures for bribes to police and immigration officials. And recently in the Israeli press, there has been the recognition that now the Israel State Archives have opened up for the period of the 1950s to the 1980s. And it turns out, and maybe you already knew, that the documents, Itai Mack is the journalist who wrote this, he said, quote, the documents show 25,000 pages of documents have been declassified. The documents show that all of Israel's governments from the 1950s to the 1980s viewed in the vicious civil war that raged in the country, and the army's corruption and violence as both a diplomatic opportunity for the state of Israel and a business opportunity for Israel defense forces and military industries. That's the time now. So apparently Israel played an insignificant role in the establishment of Burma's and then Myanmar's army, which Matt, you know, I'm sure, ruled with lethality, it says, for much of the country. So what do we make of foreign archives and their entry into the world of archives and how we think about the problems and questions, particularly when they're produced by governments who are themselves violating Palestinians' human rights, engaging with governments like Burma, Myanmar, who also violate their own citizens' human rights?
It's a great question. I don't have an easy answer for that. I mean, from a academic point of view, when other archives open up that contain information relevant to your country of study, like the Israeli case, it can be really, really helpful because although there is a military archive in Myanmar, it is not surprisingly closed to any form of access. And it's really hard to tell what is actually recorded. And that's one of the things that made, for me, the forced labor order chapter so interesting, because it is one of the almost only examples of perpetrators documenting the crimes they're perpetrating. These were military officials writing down, ordering, what was to take place, which was a criminal act. We don't know, and we may never know, what other kinds of documentation the Army generates for itself. So getting access to records like from Israel, who knows, Russia, China, Japan, doubtful, would be really helpful. Singapore would be really helpful because the military leaders have been laundering their money through Singapore for decades. So Singapore, on the one hand, it presents itself as being squeaky clean, free of corruption, but at least in this particular case, it's not. So the extent to which we can triangulate with archival records elsewhere, fantastic. But this, I think, is a very rare case. Yeah.
Okay. We have another question. Now, please. And then we'll come back to Zoom.
When you're talking about like NGOs, like publishing information, finding the facts, verification, do you think, I guess personally, it's ever okay to do the opposite and suppress information? And I'll bring in the example, Amnesty International recently they published info about Russian POWs being mistreated in Ukrainian captivity. And, that leads to maybe consequences with Russia using that as propaganda info to, push the war, like, oh, they're treating us terribly. So I just want to your thoughts on that.
It's a very tough ethical question. I mean, you get basic factors like redaction, erasing people's names or substituting fake names or other kinds of information that doesn't change the facts of what you're reporting, who, what, where, why, when, and how, but you're trying to protect identities from retaliation. So that is a standard practice, not always followed, standard practice. The question of whether to publish or not to publish, I would defer to my colleagues close to the conflict to make that judgment call that they should do in consultation with relevant actors. Russia's going to misuse whatever it can for propaganda purposes, whether it's worth the risk or not to publish this. I think they're better positioned to say than I am in the abstract. But I will say in the Myanmar context, there is a notable silence in the decades of human rights documentation on these various conflicts, on the abuses the non-state armed groups themselves committed. The other child soldiers, rape, torture, summary execution. That's not to, you need to be careful of saying that there's a false equivalency. The amount of those crimes in comparison with the military, very small, but a summary execution is a summary execution. So you can take an absolutist point of view saying, if this kind of treatment is wrong under international law and your job is to report violations of international law, then why shouldn't you report? You can't control how someone else might misuse it. That just means you've got more work to explain why this shouldn't be misused in this particular way. That's one stance. But I can understand people taking a different stance. You know, I don't have a better answer than that, I'm afraid.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I have a couple of questions. One had to do with the new forms of technology that you highlighted at a couple of points during your presentation. The AI imagery that was used to discover, I think it was tear gas canisters in Syria, and then the satellite imagery that was used to find gulag camps in North Korea, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
I can imagine that those new forms of technology can be presented in a way that they're made out to seem as if they discern or discover information in, say, heightened or more advanced ways than typical information gathering tools. I can also imagine that they may be just as open to, say, manipulation or misinformation. So how is it that that problem is dealt with, if it is at all? And just as much, I think they may be privileged over more traditional sources of information gathering that may in fact be better at getting at certain questions than these new forms. And then the second is, you mentioned the archival turn in the social sciences and humanities. Much of that has been defined not as much by or solely through the discovery of new information, but bringing new voices to bear, reinterpreting already existing information. I want to know how it is that your book relates to that intervention, meaning how does it add something to what it is that scholars in the humanities and social sciences have been doing? I got from your concluding remarks that what you're trying to do is to expand beyond the narrowly legalistic definition of what constitutes crimes or harms, opening up to more systematic and socioeconomic ones. Does it add something to how it is that we reinterpret information the way that, again, scholars in these other fields have done?
Oh, sure. Well, the first question, just in sum for people who are in, to sum up for people in Zoom, was how are, and this is how I'll respond to it, sort of international bodies, criminal bodies like the ICC, I can speak directly to that, handling different forms of so-called digital evidence, and how is it weighted, assessed? Is it given more weight than testimonies or this and that? And how does that process work? So that's the first question. The second question asks me to situate the book and my comments about the archival turn and the social sciences and humanities, about what does it in effect add or shift in those ongoing conversations. So to the first one, there is no simple answer, obviously. And I'll give you the case of the ICC because I've spoken to people in the office of the prosecutor and can speak from what they shared with me. And one of the central problems is because of the way the court is designed, and it's sort of hybrid legal organization between civil and criminal law, the different legal systems, is that they will accept almost anything into evidence. They have a very low bar, Rule 87, I believe it is. You can put almost anything into evidence, but the court will not tell you whether they excluded it or not as part of their deliberations. They don't disclose that. So you don't know if what you submitted was actually accepted or not and carried any probative value in their decision making. So that really makes it difficult on the one hand for prosecutors to know what is working and why, because one ICC decision is not bound by another ICC decision. That the concurrent trials do not inform one another. There's no precedent building per se that we think of in the US context acted at the ICC context, as I understand it. And defense lawyers find it really difficult because they themselves don't know what was included or excluded from deliberations. So they themselves don't know how to prepare their counter arguments to the prosecution. So in other words, it's a very gray murk in which there are no standardized rules, no standardized training. The judges go off of what they know and what they believe, or what arguments they have taken into consideration from the juries, but they don't have the technical background to ask the right questions in many cases. And so we're in a, I don't know the expression, but they're breaking new ground, or I'll put it this way. They're building a plane while flying it, might be the best expression. They're learning as they go. Flying by the seat of their pants, you can come up with whatever expression you want. So it's really hard to draw conclusions across cases and then say, how might that be useful for future cases or in other venues like the International Court of Justice, which is the UN body. It's just, there's not enough experience yet. As to the second question, in some ways, to the second question is, what if anything new does the book offer in light of the archival turn in the social sciences and humanities? On one hand, you can say next to nothing. You can say this is just a fancy repackaging of the social construction of facts and so on. And I think that's an unfair reduction of what I'm after, but the fashioning of facts is very much related to that. What is new is that there is almost nothing written about human rights archives. Certainly in Burma, but there are journals, archival studies and archiveria where there have been some interesting theoretical work done, reconceptualizing archives. Again, as you suggested, bringing in voices that were marginalized or silenced over that. I'm not bringing those voices in because this isn't a book about victims. It describes and analyzes the violence they've experienced, but the focus is on the people documenting them. That is, the people producing the archives themselves and how they're used and misused. So by using some of the techniques or approaches in that body of scholarship, I'm looking at their work rather than going into an archive and trying to pull out what has not been written or has been overwritten by dominant history. So in my sense, that's quite different. Certainly in the human rights field, there's a real dearth of that. So I think that's where the contribution lies.
So we have a question on Zoom. The question is a bit more political. What are your views on the politics surrounding Myanmar's parallel government, NUG, and armed revolution by People's Defense Forces, an ethnic armed organization? Can they be successful? I don't know what the measure of success would be in that.
Yes, and the person who posed the question is welcome to define success. I mean, if success is defined as regime change and the restoration of democracy and human rights and so on and so forth, unlikely, certainly over the short term. While Myanmar has had only on a few occasions democratic elections, it does not have democratic institutions. There's not a culture of democracy in the way that in ideal terms we describe it here. And the same criticism can be leveled at the US's political system. There's the difference between the theory and the concepts and the actual ways institutions actually work. And in the context of Myanmar, it's personal politics. They're not party platforms driven by policies. It's influential people who've got the resources to redistribute to others in the form of opportunities, money, jobs, and so on, that gets people to follow you. And that, in an authoritarian context, is usually not a recipe for good governance, to put it bluntly. So the people elected and who formed the National Unity Government, the government in exile, most of them are very senior, or I should say in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. They grew up under successive military regimes. And many of them were political prisoners. They were not, however, politicians in the sense of actually policymakers. They don't know how to govern. And that is a real problem when you don't have a government. You have people elected to office, but they don't have a government. And that's been the biggest problem of Aung San Suu Kyi's role while she was in power before arrest. The People's Defense Forces is the general name for these ad hoc militias that have formed all over the country, who fashion simple weapons, and since then they've been receiving actually modern weaponry who've been conducting with great efficiency raids on government and military outposts, usually killing the troops and the government officials and the police in shootouts. And so whole swaths of the country have broken down into this kind of asymmetric violence. And the military regime and police forces, security forces respond by killing civilians. There have been thousands and thousands of homes burnt. They're dropping incendiary bombs on schools, strafing civilians from helicopters and so on. So they're not directly engaging the people's defense forces. For the most part, the ethnic armed organizations have refrained from launching offensive actions against the army. They're providing training and support for the defense forces, the militias, but they've not resumed open combat with the military. I think they are waiting to see what happens and then decide whether to become more active in terms of operational terms or not. So that's why I said it's on one hand, very fluid. Things are changing several times each day, but it's a stalemate in that neither the defense forces nor the security forces can defeat the other right now.
So you mentioned how the UN does provide humanitarian support for Myanmar. What would occur, like, what do you think could the UN politically get involved with Myanmar's military instead of the refugees? And like, what would the outcome look like if they did get involved with the military?
Could you elaborate on what you mean by involved?
With like supporting countries and countries that don't think that Myanmar's issue is an internal conflict. If
Okay.
we were to send out people who would go in and possibly like help not only the refugees, but also fight against the military in Myanmar, would that like result in bigger wars? And do you think Myanmar has the capability to threat other countries if they were to get involved?
The question concerns what, if anything, can the UN do more proactively inside Myanmar that might lead to either in the short term or long term, some sort of successful resolution, positive, beneficial outcome for the people of Myanmar. That's how I understood it. Is that a fair summary? It's a difficult question because the UN does not have an army. It has peacekeeping forces. And those peacekeeping forces, the so-called blue helmets, have to be invited in. The UN can't just send them into Myanmar and just arbitrarily decide you go here, you go there. They have to be allowed in by the government. And the question is, who here is the legitimate representative of the government? And some countries believe it is the military regime, and other people believe it's the national unitary government. And that's also an issue in the lawsuits. Who is the party involved in the proceedings? The other issue with the blue helmets is they can only fire if they are directly fired upon. So if the army is shooting at civilians, if they follow policy correctly, they can't do anything about it. It's only when they are shot at themselves can they fire back. Now they can try and create humanitarian corridors so civilians can move. They can try and create humanitarian zones and camps where, in theory, they would be safe from attack. We know from many countries around the world that rarely works in the intended way. So the short answer is, in my view, I'm just giving you my opinion, the answer does not lie with the UN. The answer lies with the oil companies. That if Unocal and Total and Chevron decided they were going to stop pumping oil in protest to what is happening inside Myanmar today, stop pumping their pipelines, this would be over in a week. The only legal source of money that the regime has is the oil money. And so even if Thailand said, we're going to stop importing gas through the pipelines on the west side of the country, that would have a devastating blow. Because what is the money used for? Certainly personal enrichment, certainly also for weapons, but also to buy loyalty. And when those funds are gone, that breaks down. And so if you had a serious fissure in the military regime where someone peeled off and had a coup against the coup, that could lead to a resolution. But I think until something significant changes, it's only if there's a major shock to the system like that you'll see any significant change anytime soon. She had a question up first, and then I'll come over to you.
Since that the UN chemical analysts are invited, what is the United Nations doing now to help people in Myanmar, civilians?
Whole areas of the country, even before the coup, were declared off limits by the government. So the UN used to be able to deliver humanitarian aid to displaced persons in Kachin State, the far north along the Chinese border, where there are over 90,000 people in dire humanitarian need. They decided they didn't want the UN knowing what was happening up there, so they banned them. And then a year later, 18 months later, it banned all NGOs. So there's this blank spot up there where nearly 100,000 IDPs, possibly more now because of the fighting, who are living day to day in horrible conditions. We know nothing about because China won't let us access from that side, and we can't access from the Myanmar side. So there are whole swaths, but there are other forms of aid that have been going on piecemeal, some education, some health, some to Rohingya in the displaced person camps.
The
But-
government's allowing those things.
Things it believes to be apolitical, but almost all of that is shut down now. Since the fighting happened after the coup, you can't travel.
What started all this in the first
What's this being what?
conflict between the two groups? What started this conflict?
Well, that question, to do it justice, would require another hour, which I'm afraid you probably don't have or want for that matter. And you'd have to go back to the pre-colonial period and walk through these, the Karen area that I did my work in, that was home to the world's longest counterinsurgency. It lasted over 70 years. And it has in many ways resumed in recent years anyway. The short answer is, from my perspective, my understanding, the military, which had held power for more than 3 generations, not 3 decades, 3 decades and change, like to call the shots. Like Pakistan, it's a state within a state. They live in a completely different world than your regular people. One, two, there's deep personal hatred between the head of the military, now coup president, and Aung San Suu Kyi. They loathe each other. And she is by far, although not problematic in her own way, was going to be elected as the legal head of the country when the head of the military himself wanted to be the head. So putting her in jail under trumped up charges was very attractive to him. They used the Republican strategy of unfair elections, corruption, and so on to invalidate the entire election. And again, it gets very complicated, but the basic, oversimplified but basic thing is military wanted to retain power because it worked for them, and the hell with anyone else. And because they had done it for decades, they thought they could do it again and things would blow over in a month, and it didn't. So that's why we have this.
Probably Asian history courses with Professor Ropers and Professor Chen might be helpful too in this area.
Yes, I outsource my work to him. And he can outsource it to something I've written, so it's fixed. Yes.
That for military control for it's a year now, a little over a year now.
Yeah.
Are we in a situation now, which I guess people can have perspectives and different points of views when it comes to answering this question, where definite now, and if no one knows when, democracy is gonna be regained. Or are there any inferences or thoughts, I guess, that, sometime soon, or in a year, or in 2 years, or in 5 years, or in a few months, that democracy would be regained, or like are we in a situation that where it's just like indefinite and the military is just doing what they want to do, and like there's no way that we can like just go back. But I mean, there's been history of but I guess we'll be in a situation now where like you can't, like no one can do anything about it. Like the military.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I haven't seen any credible forecasting as to when there might be some resolution either way to this. There's so many actors, there's so many different conflicts. It's not a simple matter to sort of come back to your question about good guys and bad guys, although one could sort of conceive of the exile government as good guys and the military as bad guys. That's certainly, but there's so many other conflicts over so many other things that have nothing to do with democracy, if you will, or human rights. There might have been some action or movement in some way if Ukraine didn't happen. But as you may know from your courses, especially if you take political science or international relations, you'll know the international community has a short attention span. One day it's Syria, and then we move on to Ukraine, and then Yemen for a week, and then it moves somewhere else. And if you have a conflict of this magnitude, as is the case with all of us, heaven forbid Ethiopia, you can't solve it in a week. You can't solve it in a year. And to be perfectly honest, given the authoritarian military history of Burma since independence in 1948, you're really talking about generations. You have to completely change mindsets. Capacity building is not a 3-year project, it's a lifetime. Anyone who's had a child knows that. Not to compare people in Burma as children, but the point being, if you want to radically transform the institutions and values of practices in a way that respects basic human rights of everyone, regardless of whether you're a Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, or Gachin, Karen, Shin, Bama, that's going to take 60 years minimum. So you can change who holds power formally, but a lot more work needs to be done, especially after 6-7 decades of military operations against civilians. And I believe you had a question?
I have 3 questions.
Okay.
They're related.
Oh,
So the first question is, have any countries recognized the government in exile for Myanmar as the legitimate government of the country?
I'm embarrassed. I should know that, but I can't answer confidently. And the reason statements have been made, statements of support. Several different European countries, the United States, but statement of support is not the same thing as we formally recognize. The ambassador to the UN shortly after the coup began in February of 2021 came out and denounced the coup and the military for doing this. Myanmar ambassador to the UN. And not surprisingly, he lost his job. But because he's living in exile, he's not in jail or dead. So I guess it was a fair trade-off. But to my knowledge, the UN has not credentialed, the fancy term they use, anyone else to take his place. So unless I'm mistaken, certainly at the UN level, it's an empty chair. And I don't think the NUG has sent ambassadors to the embassy in Washington, D.C., for example, because all the people in there were appointed by the military for the most part. When you fall out of favor in the military, you usually get promoted to a diplomatic position and sent abroad. And this is all kind of exile. So that's who you have in most of the major embassies abroad. That's my partial answer to you.
Okay, and so if the government in exile were to be, could they accept UN peacekeepers into the country, if they're recognized as legit, and would the UN that entry? That's that entry.
That's an interesting follow-up question to the other student's question earlier. Oppose this question, yeah. Here, I think we would butt up in the question of theory versus practice.
Well,
I mean, because let me just add a little bit more, and then if I miss this, you can redirect me. NUG, many but not all of them are in exile. Others are still in the country but in hiding. And they do their meetings via Zoom. I've met.
We should have invited them
I
tonight.
know, they would have done a better job. And so let's, even for the sake of argument, assume they are declared the legitimate heads of state. They don't control the armed forces. And the UN can't send in its peacekeepers without an invitation. You might say they're invited, but then I could imagine the security forces standing at the airport and the ports and not let them in. And perhaps fighting breaking out if they try to force them. So I don't know, without further violence, I don't know how you could get them in. Does that answer your question, or did I misunderstand you?
No, you answered it, just, just kind of within that, you said that the peacekeepers can fire back if they're fired upon. It sounds terrible, but would an incident like that bring international attention and end up being beneficial and create real change in the region?
I would say it would make things worse. The closest military partner the military regime has right now is Russia. It's buying tons of gear from Russia right now. They may have second thoughts seeing how it worked in Ukraine. I know, but it's still, it's still more than what the other people have. And China is Myanmar's biggest trading partner. And it has immense influence with the top generals for a variety of reasons. And given China's historic stance on non-interference and Russia's stance on everything we're familiar with following the news, having Western European, North American forces invade, for lack of a better term, would make things worse. Sure.
I would just add on that, we'd also have to look at the success of Western North American interventions in other places.
Yeah.
Middle East is going through a lot of other places.
You can throw in Afghanistan, Libya.
So my last question was, you said that, if countries surrounding them didn't pump oil anymore, then it'd be over. Has there been any international push, or any kind of accountability or, economic withholding to influence countries to actually take this action?
Another great question, and it's a real challenge. The easy thing to do is sanction the leaders, which means they can't travel abroad and go shopping in Singapore. They can't get a visa to travel. And if they have overseas bank accounts that people know of, they can freeze those accounts. And they do that to their wives and their children and so on. And that may or may not have a significant impact. These people have resources in the country. It's not going to be a huge inconvenience. Other kinds of sanctions can be effective, but you run the risk of hurting the very people you want to help. So with economic sanctions, if you target industries like the garment industry, which is the biggest employer of women and girls in the country, and you stop that, you're actually hurting them and their families lose their jobs. So there's this real trade-off is how do you do what's called targeted sanctions that get at those deemed to be responsible as opposed to broad blanket sanctions that will harm a population that's already really suffering. So that's what I'm saying. There have been sanctions.
Sanctions, in countries surrounding Myanmar, other than Myanmar.
There has been pressure mostly by NGOs, but some other actors to get the oil companies to stop pumping gas. The oil companies say they would be breaching contract and that would be a legal problem. And they're not involved, all the kinds of expressions or explanations you'd expect. But it would not be to anyone's advantage for the US to try and sanction India, Bangladesh, China, and Thailand, for example. That's just it's making things worse. You can target some people in Myanmar, and that's about it.
Just as a human rights practitioner and also as a scholar, and I look forward to reading your book. I think I just wonder, in terms of this project, and in terms of what you're interested in doing with archives, I can really see the benefit, within bringing sort of human rights, in terms of reviving human rights transparency in the process, and in terms of social reform and that sort of thing. And so within academic circles and institutional circles, I guess I wonder, as you were sort of pursuing this project as a practitioner, and as a scholar, whether there were you had ambivalence or concerns revolving around sort of the implications as a project like this could circulate in sort of the broader sort of society, and sort of make it more challenging for human rights organizations to sort of document, as well as particularly, as we said, in areas where there's uneven access to information, so the strategies that they use to try to highlight, particularly in challenging areas, human rights violations.
I have no doubt that some critics of human rights will, if I should have the fortune of them buying my book and reading it, using it in ways I did not attend, using it as a way to try and critique the human rights project as a whole, and that it's a waste. And I don't think I make that argument, although I think I could be misread in that way. But yeah, I still believe that the human rights movement, if you will, and I'm not even sure that's the right word for it, can and must do a better job about how it does its job. Because I've seen too many, a group goes out and does 4 interviews and then makes claims about X, Y, and Z. And I'm not saying it has to be statistically representative. I need to go out and have a sample size of 1,500 and do multi-cluster sampling and so on and so forth. But you need to have a better sense of what you're actually looking at, how it was collected, and where it was coming from, and how it was analyzed. So I'll give you just another quick example. In my chapter on narrativity, it's devoted to reading testimonies about this Northern Offensive I mentioned during the presentation. And I had about 1,200 pages of testimonies from people who had some knowledge of what happened during that military operation. And the interviews were coded by an international human rights law clinic, and I won't say which one, but it's a prestigious one, located in New England. And I'll stop there. It narrows it down, but it still doesn't quite tell you which one. And they identify patterns, which is one of the things you do with crimes against humanity. What is widespread and/or systematic? It doesn't have to be both. It can be either or, but in most cases it is both, to see if it's evidence of state policy and not just rogue actors acting on their own. You're trying to look at command and control relationships. And I looked at these testimonies, and of course, some are not useful, and others are immensely useful. You've got your expert informants who go on for 20 pages with great detail and operational knowledge and so on. And those were coded and put into categories or under themes that were then written about in this policy memo that was distributed at the UN, diplomatically, NGO, human rights community, and so on, really influential. But when you go back and read the testimonies, rather than looking at how they're cited in the bottom in terms of number, you realize that at one moment, the person talking is talking as a victim, first person victim. Other times they're a witness, maybe direct, maybe indirect. Other times they're sharing hearsay and so on. That at different moments in the same interview, the statements being made are coming from different subject positions, which has implications for how we should assess and give weight to what they're saying occurred. And all of that disappears when you simply cite the numbers. Yeah. That extrajudicial execution, see interviews 34, 54, 76, 78, 79. And because that wasn't released, but I had permission to look at the unredacted information, it very quickly became clear that not that the policy brief was somehow invalid or done unethically, but if you were to actually use this material in a legal setting, because these were done as affidavits, that's how they were written up and prepared as a legal affidavit, a defense counsel would have a field day picking apart the narratives and saying, well, how did you reach these conclusions? Because this is obviously hearsay, that's third hand. This is, is both a victim and a witness. And so my point being, if you're interested in using these things at a legal level and not just for an advocacy level, you have to have a better understanding of how the work you do now can fall under discovery in a court setting and the implications that has both for the credibility of your evidence, but the security of the people who shared that information. Because once it's entered into discovery, the defense counsel has access to those same interviews and therefore the identifying information. So this is just part of the point I was trying to make at the end, and perhaps not so clearly, is that on one hand, it's good that many human rights NGOs are familiarizing themselves with what is admissible in different legal venues, because increasingly the courts are giving them less and less weight. They used to give them a lot of weight at first, and after, since 2002 with the ICC, they look at the material and say, well, actually, we have questions about how this was selected in the plan.
Because both in this example and in an earlier example, there is a question of legibility, right? This seems to be key, and evidence archive is what it is. And as you say, so I guess it's being produced to be made legible. Yeah. So I guess the transparency of the process seems to me to be important, but it's also about scrutinizing the kind of evidence that exists. I suppose. And I was thinking earlier that there must be expert witnesses. These, for example, a narrative from someone who is not a victim of trauma, who's not able to sort of use a coherent narrative. And
Yeah,
No, I completely agree.
I have just one very general question because, as a medievalist, I was very interested in what you said about the court never releasing, that there was this gray area where, in fact, the criteria for submission of evidence was not clear. That made me think of a lot of practice, of medieval judicial practice.
Except for the Inquisition file.
Yeah. My question is more general in the sense that I was very interested in your description of archives as non-stable. It's as processual, but yet by nature. So archives are result from that accumulation, right? And what are the problems that result from having this abundance of materials, and how fast it is that the materials become available to these organizations to make their art, right? This means that archives very soon will get to dimensions that require a lot of resources to maintain. So my question is about what is the future of these archives? Are they going to survive only in the institutional setting where this information became meaningful? Or in state archives in case states are involved, or in the oil company archives? So I would say in 100 years, what is going to happen to these archives? How do you see that? evolve?
I think you'll see all of those outcomes. You know, just for one example, one of my chapters is on humanitarian assistance to internally displaced persons. And it looks at the work that two different Korean human rights organizations did. But as part of their work, they effectively functioned like military intelligence. The amount of information they had to produce about the Myanmar military and its operations to provide an evidentiary basis to their funders to prove that they weren't making up numbers to get aid. So, you know, you get this funny inversion. And I've known some of the people who are part of this consortium for 10, 15 years, and they gave me permission to look at the field records they got from these groups that would report back on all the people that were displaced, how much rice was destroyed, what other things they lost, who was killed, which battalions were responsible, how many people were wounded, et cetera, et cetera. Very, very detailed, almost like situation reports, sit reps like you would in military jargon. And their records were pieces of fax paper of varying length and varying legibility that, you know, they typed them up in their field offices and then faxed it to the consortium office, which would then review it in light of all the other information they had received about from all these other groups across the whole border to make an informed judgment. This is legitimate and warrants funding in the form of rice to support the displaced persons or to reject the proposal. So I went through years and years of folders with this, and as you know, on fax paper, for those of you who are young,
It's going to disappear.
it's the ink sort of smudges off after a while, and yeah, that's not going to last. They agreed they should digitize it, but I don't know they're ever going to get around to it. That may be gone in a couple of years if they haven't thrown it out by now. Things get recycled all the time, or they get wet in the rains, or bugs eat them. Other things have longer staying power, and those are the ones, like you mentioned, that have more institutionalized resources. So oil companies, yes. A certain law clinic, yes.
International tribunals, certainly.
Yeah,
It's
certainly.
archive, right?
Yeah, but yeah, the ICC isn't always forthcoming with what it has. So access, I don't know in 20, 30 years whether the ICC will allow the first 10 years of this stuff to come in. But other things do come in. So I don't know, we'll see what, like Israel, maybe something will happen in Myanmar.
So I know that there are more questions out there, and I want to invite you to come to the reception and maybe talk in person with Professor McLean and ask you if you would, maybe just in a final reply, you suggested that there's more that the human rights, you called it movement, maybe community, right? People interested in human rights, more that needs to be done, more that should be done. You also mentioned that a case probably, people could misinterpret what your book is about and say that human rights need to be squashed. Could you, for the sake of students, give them an indication of how they might contribute to the human rights community, particularly in these really perplexing cases, decades and decades in the making? Maybe talk just a little bit about Fortify Rights, which I know you're on the advisory board of human rights organization specifically working in Southeast Asia. You know, we were talking to faculty before, and we said, you know, I mentioned I always tell students studying human rights that you have to expect not to be uplifted, but I'm asking you to uplift a little bit, if you wouldn't mind, to close out.
I'll come back to two words that my colleague mentioned, that's scholar and practitioner. I consider myself to be a scholar practitioner. Imagine a little hyphen in between the two to connect them. Because I pursued both careers, often simultaneously, at great detriment to my health and my family and other things, but that's for drinks. But for me, one of the challenges, but one of the joys and great benefits of trying to have a foot in both communities is I think practitioners can gain so much by being familiar with not just like good research methodologies, but scholarly literature that is relevant to the issues you're working on. Whether it's archival theory or narrativity studies, translation studies, what have you, political science, that are relevant, while at the same time, scholars, which often spend their lives hunched over their computers in little offices and don't necessarily get out into the real world very often, could greatly benefit by talking to practitioners who say, this is the reality, this is what we work with. You can complain about me all you want, but I don't have electricity more than 45 minutes a day. Or my research team speaks 6 languages and, a meeting takes 3 hours with all the translation. What do you expect? And so this notion of theory and practice, and not to make it too much of a rigid binary, because practitioners have their own theories about how things work. And scholars have their own practices. So it really goes in both directions. So I would encourage you, if you pursue a career, whether you're in the academy as a professor or a practitioner, don't stop reading, don't stop talking, absorb as much as you can, because you'll be surprised how some paper you read in an Asian history course about Southeast Asia may be relevant 10 years from now when you're working on something completely different. Right. Was that uplifting?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you
Please,
for having me.
everybody Join us to the right. I thought it was the left, it's to the right at the end of the building for our reception. If you are interested in the minor, you have the little brochures in front of you. I'm Professor Katz. Feel free to reach out to me in the history department. I'm the advisor for the minor. If you are interested, reach out to me and I'll talk about it. Thanks to the folks who joined us on Zoom, and to everybody here. One more round of applause.